Okay, so this is, well, I'll get right into it. We did a survey in 2011 of peering agreements, and this is the sort of 5-year follow-on. We're going to try to continue doing these every 5 years in order to build some time series data, help people understand how the carrier interconnection environment is evolving over time. So in 2011, we asked 3 questions. Is the agreement formalized in a written document, or is it a handshake agreement? Does the agreement have symmetric terms, or do the parties exchange different things? And what's the country of governing law of the agreement if one is defined? This year we added, last time we analyzed 142,000 agreements from 4,300 internet service providers, 96 countries. The data's been up there for the last 5 years. It's been downloaded 500,000 times over that time. We promise to do it again every 5 years. Last time it was input to the OECD member country guidelines for essentially internet regulation. So it was used as a justification by a lot of OECD member countries for not regulating internet service providers. It essentially said, because this is already working well with industry self-regulation, we do not need to add governmental regulation on the top of that. And if you guys are interested at the end, I can go into that argument in a little bit more detail and why that argument works. So we added one more question this time. Are you exchanging IPv6 traffic with this peer, right? So for every respondent, what we got back was a table of their peers by AS, and for each agreement, on each row of that table, answers to these now 4 questions. So this time we got back data about 1.9 million peering agreements, representing a bit over 10,000 carriers, 148 countries. Including all 35 OECD member countries and 21 of the UN least developed countries. So we're both getting all of the most developed countries and also a statistically significant, the majority of the undeveloped countries as well. So the heat map that you see there is how many responses we got from each country. So not normalized by how many possible responses there could have been from that country. So there are some countries in, say, Central Asia and Africa that look very light, but where we actually have 100% response rate, right? Every AS that peers in that country responded, but that may only be like 5 ASs. So this is a graph of proportion of representation. The red line is how many responses we got in that country. Of the 2 blue area graphs, the high one is how many ASs are assigned in that country, and the low one is how many of those appear as transit provider ASs in the routing table. So what you see there is that we're generally getting somewhere between, say, 10 and 50% of the assigned ASs responding, and that in many cases that is more than the number of transit ASs. So we are getting responses from stub networks, which are typically content provider networks, as well as carrier networks that are providing transit to other ASs. So one thing to take note of here is that Indonesia which is the world's 4th largest country by population, is up from number 18 in this number of responses to number 5 this year. Indonesia has had a huge amount of growth relative to other countries in peering over the last 5 years. So they changed far more than any other country changed over the last 5 years. And I'll get to reasons for that later. Just under half of the total comprised matching pairs. So out of any 4 responses we got, 2 of the responses were representing the same peering session from both sides. So for that half, that 49.35%, we were able to judge how accurate the responses were because we had 2 different people telling us what should have been exactly the same thing. And 98.71% of the time, those answers were in exact agreement. That's down from 99.52% last time, and we attribute that to the addition of the IPv6 question. The more questions we ask, the more opportunities there are for 2 parties to get the answers different. So we still think 98.71 is very good and not cause for any worry. So in addition to those 4 structured questions, we also did sort of unstructured verbal interviews, follow-up interviews with about 35 network operators, typically larger ones, to sort of get a better understanding of reasons for patterns that we were seeing. So to get into the kind of the main findings here, 99.93% of peering agreements are handshake. This is up from 99.51% in 2011. So we went from 1 in 200 then to 1 in 1,400 today. A lot of people say, but what about the big networks? The big networks have fewer handshake agreements. True, but the big networks also have fewer agreements total. So there are a bunch of respondents in here who had thousands of agreements. There are also a bunch of respondents that had tens of agreements. Of the ones that had tens of agreements, you have a bimodal split between little guys, who should have tens of agreements because they're small, and really big guys. And you'll see that graphed out later. But this is not thrown off by not having responses from the big guys or by, whatever. Anyway, we'll go on. So one of the reasons that we got out of the verbal interviews for why this change is a lot of people said, well, yeah, we had 1 in 200 written agreements 5 years ago, but those expired. And we kept the peering session, but nobody bothered to re-sign new paperwork around it. And that was by far the most prevalent reason people cited. 99.98% had symmetric terms. That means that the parties were giving and receiving the same things. You could take the names of the parties, reverse them, and there would be no change in the sense of the agreement. The alternative, of course, is an agreement in which one party gives thing X and the other party gives thing Y. So that would be, for instance, a paid peering agreement, where somebody is giving something other than customer routes. So that's up from 99.73 5 years ago. So we went from 1 in 400 to 1 in 4,800. There's a lot more talk about paid peering than there are actual sessions, because there are salespeople out there who get revenue from a paid peering agreement, and they are being paid to talk about paid peering agreements, and they're being paid to make potential customers feel like that is a mainstream thing to do. But the numbers do not bear that out. So from the verbal interviews where we primarily found paid peering was between large but not market dominant content networks and large market dominant eyeball networks. So a large market dominant eyeball network would typically be able to extract revenue from a large but not market dominant content network. And the content network folks always said that that was not by their choice, unsurprisingly. Well, sorry, that's overstating things a little bit. Some of them said, well, we live with it, it gets the job done, you know, would we pay money if we didn't have to? Of course not, but you know, no big complaints. Okay, so there continue to be strong preferences for country of governing law. This has changed a little bit because we've had the Snowden disclosures since the 5 years ago survey. So it didn't so much change the top three and the bottom three, but just inside of that, countries have shifted a bit. So US, Canada, Japan remain the top three. Romania, Ukraine, and Russia remain the bottom three, but Iceland and Finland moved up in terms of favored countries, and China and Thailand moved down. So that's the graph. The red line in the center is showing the the 100 and some odd countries in the middle that are axed out of the graph for clarity because they're just somewhere in the middle and not of particular note. One thing to notice here is that the probabilities at the bottom end are much lower than the probabilities are high at the top end, and that's because this is not normalized for number of agreements. So there are a lot more agreements in the US and Canada than there are, for instance, in Romania, Russia, and Ukraine. So that's why the bottom end looks considerably lower than the top end looks high. Sorry if that was incoherent, but I'm sure you all basically get what I'm saying. Okay, nearly all peering is multilateral peering. It was already kind of a majority 5 years ago, and everybody's response to this is, oh, but that doesn't matter, that's just looking at AS pairs, it's not weighted by amount of traffic that flows across each pair. Yeah, we don't know how much traffic flowed across each pair. That was not our survey. If we tried to survey on that, we would get a much lower response rate. So this is just looking at AS adjacencies. If we look at AS adjacencies, it's the vast majority, like something like 98% of AS adjacencies are through route servers now, whereas it was something like 60% 5 years ago. And the reason for this is when you add the 900th peering session on a route server, that guy immediately gets 899 more peers. Growth happens fast when you get sort of exponential cumulative, you know, as these route servers get big. The little route servers obviously don't make much difference at all. A route server with 5 people on it or 10 people on it is only contributing 25 or 100 adjacencies total. But we'll get to this in a sec. One in Jakarta that has 1,021 peers on it. That's more than 1 million adjacencies right there in one city. The main thing that we found about the multilateral peering and why it is that commands so much less attention from people is that it's fire and forget, right? People set it up once and then they just don't go back and look at it again. They don't think about the fact that after they set it up, 50 more people showed up and they now have 50 more adjacencies than they did when they set it up, or 500 more. So because people don't have to think about it, it doesn't consume a lot of labor, it doesn't get a lot of thinking on their part. So sorry if this is a little hard to see. This is interconnection partners per network. So the y-axis here is how many networks have this number on the x-axis of partners. So, for instance, there are about 10 networks that have 500 partners, right? So if you go across on the x-axis to 500 and look up, the bar goes up to about 10, for instance. And there's a number there at about, it's like 420 or 425 that is the Moscow MLPA. There's a peak that's defined by the Moscow MLPA with about 105 networks that have 425 peers. So if we, and also just to make clear, you see how the trend line does not hit the bottom of the graph there. I'm only showing networks with up to 1,500 connection partners. We've axed out the 112 largest ones, which would make this graph 3 times as wide. So if we zoom in on Jakarta, specifically looking at the Jakarta matrix IX, what you see is a very typical peak and drop off for a number of interconnection partners. So at 1,021, there's a peak of 102 or so networks that have 1,021 partners. Those are the 102 networks that participate in that one route server and do not peer anywhere else. They have exactly one peering session. It is with that route server. They get all of the other 1,021 routes from that route server, but they have no other peering session anywhere with anybody, right? Then there are 22 networks that have exactly one other peering session. There are 59 networks that have 2 other peering sessions, and so forth, right? So you get this, where there's a route server, you get this spike and drop off. But the thing to remember about this is that if there's another route server somewhere to the left of this on the graph, it's also got a long tail, and that long tail is also contributing to this part of the graph, right? And there's no way to separate those out from the data set that we have. So this is not a perfectly clean representation of just the Jakarta matrix IX. This is mostly Jakarta matrix IX, and there are a few bits of data that have been contributed to this part of the graph by stuff further to the left. So this is looking at what countries benefit from multilateral peering agreements most. The red trend line is the number of peers participating in multilateral agreements. The tall blue area is the number of adjacencies gained by that, and the bars at the bottom are the number of MLPAs in that country that we were able to identify in the data set. So there are undoubtedly more MLPAs that exist than are represented in these bars, but these were the ones that we were able to actually identify. So Indonesia only has 2 MLPAs, both in Jakarta, but they have the largest number of adjacencies because one of those 2 has more than 1,000 participants. Germany was the next with 10 MLPAs in different exchange points around Germany. Almost as many actual adjacencies coming out of that. France, UK, Russia, US, so forth, Australia. I think this starts to give you an idea of just how many adjacencies we're talking about coming out of these route servers. It's a big deal. Okay, the bad news, V6, only 3.88% of the respondents, or of the peering sessions were said to be carrying V6 traffic. We're 20 years into V6 deployment now, so 3.88% seems kind of low and unfortunate. Of the 30 most represented countries in the data set, the 30 largest countries, Russia had the highest rate of V6 routing at 21%, Ukraine at 10, Brazil at 6, US at 4.7, but every other country in the top 30 was below the global average. Right? So big countries are not doing particularly well at this. So that's just a graph of the red line across is at 3.88%, and those are the 30 largest countries. Indonesia on the V6 side of things doesn't really show up at all, right? Almost no V6 peering happening in Indonesia. So a lot of sessions, not much V6. So a lot of what we find is that some countries are doing well at one thing and not well at another. There's a huge discrepancy between large networks and small networks with V6. And this is also always one of those things where it's hard to visualize, right? You have to kind of pick what parts you're looking at. So of the dozen largest respondents, all of them were routing V6, and they were on average advertising more than 100 V6 prefixes each. And they were on average peering V6 with more than 70% of their peers. That all sounds really good. But of the smallest half of the entire data set, 92% had no V6 peers or prefixes at all. And they averaged less than half of a prefix each of the bottom half. And they averaged only 0.15% of their sessions supporting V6. So the bottom half are doing really, really badly, and the top 12 are doing just fine, and people in the middle are, sort of, you get the idea. Okay, so this is looking at our Exchange directory. We're now tracking a portion of the traffic generated at each exchange point that is V6, and we see actually that these things do correlate reasonably closely, right? So in Moscow specifically, the exchange there is doing 17.5% V6 traffic, and that correlates with 21% of the peering sessions being V6 enabled. In Seattle, 4.75% of the traffic is V6, 4.7% of the peering sessions are V6 enabled. Amsterdam, 2.1% of the traffic is V6, and 0.2% of the peering sessions are V6 enabled. So it seems, so this is comparing apples and oranges, percentage of traffic to number of peering sessions, but the fact that they agree with each other relatively well tells us that they're reasonably good stand-ins for each other. There is a reasonably close correlation. Okay, often with statistics about networks, you get a correlation between good stuff and wealth of the country that you're looking at. And here we don't really see that with V6. So this is a log scale scatter plot of IPv6 peering sessions supporting IPv6 routing versus GDP per capita, right? How wealthy is the country on a per capita basis? And it is a complete mess. There is no trend there, nothing at all. The vertical line is at 3.88%. The sort of sloping red line is if you were going to try and plot a trend line out of this blob, which is meaningless. All that says is that there is a slightly lower rate of V6 in wealthy countries than in poor countries, but not a meaningfully lower amount. You look around this graph, I labeled countries around the periphery. So you've got countries like Finland that are doing pretty well and are wealthy. You've got countries like Kazakhstan that are doing a little bit better than Finland and are not particularly wealthy. You've got Rwanda, which is doing just as well as Finland, basically, and is extraordinarily poor. You've got, Pakistan, Indonesia, that are poor countries that are doing really badly. Oman, which is a wealthy country that's doing badly. Qatar is very wealthy and not doing very well. It's a mess. There's no correlation. This is a tricky one. This is looking at how many of the AS adjacencies are domestic versus how many are international on a per country basis. So it's the ratio of domestic to international, where countries with more domestic peering are darker and countries with more international peering are lighter. The reason I say this is a tricky thing to look at is because this, again, is not normalized for total numbers. It's just a ratio, right? And so normalizing wouldn't really get you to a better understanding. What you see is US, Brazil, and Russia being very dark there. So this doesn't so much tell you anything about the amount of international peering that's happening, because those countries also have very large amounts of international peering. What it's telling you is that they have huge domestic markets, and the huge domestic markets are driving huge numbers of domestic peering agreements that swamp out the also large number of international peering agreements. So if you were to look at a different graph that just said how many international peering agreements are there, you would also find that those countries, particularly Russia and the US, have a lot of international agreements. But you would find even more international agreements in Europe, because in Europe, the size of the domestic market is small relative to the size of the local international market, which you don't have in the US and Russia and Brazil. So that's why this is a complicated one to look at, right? Because it's trying to graph two interesting things in one axis of color. Okay, so if we look at the interconnection partners of the US, the large graph is V4, the small graph is V6. Those are not proportional to each other. What you see is a fair bit of domestic, Germany, Netherlands, UK, so forth. This is Russia, much, much more domestic in Russia, because it's a big country with a whole lot of medium-sized carriers. That's what the US does not have. The US does not have a lot of medium-sized carriers. UK, Germany, Indonesia. Indonesia, again, big domestic market, a lot of small carriers that peer with each other inside Indonesia. Sorry, I'm going over time, and I will try and make this really quick. This is the IPv4 announcement size relative to the number of interconnections. So the top line in the white graph is the IPv4 addresses, and the bottom line in the blue graph is the number of prefixes. And so again, you're seeing vertical spikes at the big multilateral peering agreements, and you're seeing a cluster up there of networks that are acharacteristic because they have a lot of IPv4 addresses, like 1.33 or 133 million, for instance. but a very small number of interconnection agreements. And again, this graph is truncated. We could run it out 2.5 times further to the right if we included everybody, but it gets very sparse out there. This is the same thing with V6, although I have divided by 10 to the 24th for clarity so that the graph wouldn't get too tall. So we see basically the same thing, but we see a lot more clustering on the blue graph at 1. So a lot of people are advertising exactly one IPv6 prefix, as you'd expect. And we see a lot more clustering in horizontal lines, bands, in the number of V6 addresses on site or boundaries. So there's a lot less smearing because of people advertising a lot of different prefixes at different sizes. Yeah, okay, that's it. Thank you all very much. Do we want to try questions or is there no time?
Okay. Thanks so much. Thank you very much.